I've invited on a recent Member of Parliament from Western Australia, which made some changes to their adoption legislation recently.
Oh, it's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.
Welcome to Pellowe Talk now, Peter Abetz. Thank you very much for joining me, Peter.
Good to be with you, David.
Now, you were the State Member of Parliament, the Legislative Assembly in Western Australia from 2008 to 2017 as the member for the electorate of Southern Rivers.
That's correct, yes. It was my privilege to serve.
It's a fairly long stint in Parliament, and in 2017 you then took up the role, which you currently still serve in, as the West Australian Director of Australian Christian Lobby.
Correct, yes.
What kind of, fierce things? 2017, that was about the time of the battle for the undefinition of marriage.
Yeah, I headed up the No campaign. In fact, that was my first engagement with ACL as being actually an employee, if you like, of ACL.
That was a baptism of fire.
It was a massive, although it was wonderful to see the cooperation between the different Christian communities in Western Australia and right across the denominational spectrum. People pitched in and really did their best.
Was it during your career in Parliament where Western Australia had a look at its adoption legislation?
It was actually not so much the adoption legislation, but because there were virtually no adoptions happening in Western Australia, I think it was half a dozen or something like that a year. The issue that we looked at was the whole issue of foster care, because the difficulty is that in foster care, children often moved from one household to the next, and that instability really causes a lot of harm to a child growing up. And the minister at the time, Robin McSweeney, she was the Minister for Child Protection, and she introduced a system called special guardianship, which once a family had been looking after a foster child for 2 years, they could apply for this special guardianship to the court, and if the court granted that special guardianship, that then gave them virtually guaranteed guardianship until that child reaches the age of 18. So that was a very positive measure, and I think some 300, while I was in Parliament, some 300 children actually came under that special guardianship arrangement.
Okay, so a lot more access of that arrangement than was previously happening under adoption arrangements.
Yes, and what I liked about the special guardianship arrangement was that it actually, the intent is that as much as possible that the biological parents actually maintain contact with their child. And that wasn't always possible for various reasons, obviously, but
right.
It was certainly encouraged and whenever it was possible, so that the child maintained that link with their biological parents, which I think is really important.
Yeah, definitely. So other than the bouncing around of children from house to house, were there any other issues which the legislation sought to address, or was it really primarily focused on reducing the movements for long-term children in long-term foster care from house to house?
It basically, because what was happening is that particularly, say, with drug-addicted parents, for example, children would be taken off the parents, put into foster care, and the parents would then sometimes get their act together and get their children back. For a few months, they'd get into drugs again. And so there's this constant yo-yoing of the children between mum and dad and foster home. And the whole issues that go around that was very, very disruptive for the children and not helpful. And so if the family had the child in their care for 2 years or more, they could actually apply for that special guardianship. And that really created some very stable arrangements for the children. And basically, once that special guardianship was in place, then the Department of Child Protection really was no longer involved.
Wow, that's brilliant. What kind of criticisms did the legislation get, or concerns? What were the wrinkles that had to be ironed out of it, if there was large consensus about the positives? So to simplify my question, what were the negatives and the opponents, the critics of the bill saying? And if there was large consensus, what were some of the wrinkles that needed to be ironed out?
Look, I think one of the issues that people did raise at the time is, well, what if mum and dad do get their act together permanently? They're locked out of being able to look after their children. So because it's until the age of 18, it really prevents that possibility. However, there is provision in the legislation that a court can actually, if you like, undo that. But to my knowledge, there's only been about 4 or so cases where that was actually, 7 cases were overturned out of the 300 that I'm aware of. So it's a very stable situation generally. In exceptional cases, the child can go back to the family, but that was exceedingly rare.
In those cases where those orders were overturned, was it suspected that this was the best case outcome? We'd done the best thing for the child up till now, and this was now the best thing for the child going forward? Or was it the case that perhaps there was some regret and maybe we made a mistake issuing this order and giving special guardianship for the child up until that point?
My understanding is that the case, I didn't actually follow the cases, so I'm not familiar with the detail of any of the cases, but okay. My understanding is that it was basically in the view, the court took the view that it was in the best interest of the child to go back to their biological parent or parents. Okay. So it was not that it wasn't that the people who'd been awarded the guardianship were no longer suitable. It was considered more a case that the family had now really got their act together, and that it was in the best interest of the child to go back. But interestingly, once a child gets to say 12, 13 and or so, it's actually the child gets a lot of say as to what happens. If the child says, no, I want to stay with my foster parents, then or the special guardianship parent, then that would dominate. The court would respect that.
Do you think that's usually a good thing?
Look, I think I guess it just leaves that little bit of uncertainty for parents in the special guardianship context. Will I possibly lose guardianship of this child? That certainly is an issue that would be, I guess, playing in some parents' minds. But when you think of out of 300, there were some 7 cases there where the court overturned that later. It's not a high number. It's what sort of 2%, which is I think indicates that the system works very well.
Yeah, it would be very difficult, I think, in that situation. If I imagined myself in that situation, and that's the most I can do, I would want the best interests for the child, but at the same time, my own heart may be breaking at the thought of potentially parting as you invest more and more love and affection into a child in your home for so many years. I was going to say, I think what I liked about the special guardianship arrangement is that the legislation actually requires the guardianship parents to make every effort to maintain the contact for the child with their biological parents. So I think maintaining that tie with family, I see, is very, very important. I agree. I applaud that. My emerging philosophy, evolving, or maybe a better word is the philosophy I'm refining, is to say hey, let's us as a community, not necessarily government. Government should support best practice, of course, but let's us as a community, or maybe I even want to clarify that, government should get out of the road quite often of best practice, because I think it is best done by community with appropriate licensing and regulation to make sure there's no abuses and commodification of children going on. But you're often called a member of the God Squad in West Australia Parliament because you wore your faith on your sleeve, and I do the same, and I think that's a badge of honour, to, although it may have been intended pejoratively. I think you and I would agree that God's best and ultimate ideal for every mother is to have a relationship with her child, and for every child to have a relationship with his or her biological parents. And so aiming for that as the ideal and possible restoration, I think that's fantastic. Now, again, we can't do that at the, there's a balance anyway, with stability and permanency for a child, especially with an unstable biological home environment. So yeah, heading in that direction is really good. I can't think of any flaws. I guess I'd need to consider a lot of the evidence and the specific cases of how it's going. But in the way you're articulating it sounds almost ideal. Tell me, with those hundreds, did you say 700 or so, or
300? It was 300.
Sorry.
I'm not sure what number it is now, but that was while I was in Parliament.
With those hundreds, how many of those happened with the full cooperation and support of the biological parents, as opposed to resistance and reluctance?
Because it has to go to court, so the court has to decide each case. The biological parents can actually object if they want to, but often the parents recognise that they're not in a shape to look after the child because the child's already been out of their care for over 2 years. So it's not a case, hey, you've stuffed up and therefore now we're going to put your child with another family permanently. No, it's the couple that's looking, the foster parents have to have that child in their care for 2 years at least before they can even apply for this special guardianship. So it really is for children that are in long-term foster care.
Okay.
I think ideally, foster care should be as much as possible that a short-term thing while the parents get their act together, and so that they're able to look after their child and give them the support that they needed to make that possible. That's, I think, is always the ideal that should be the objective of any child protection system.
I'm not aware enough of how good government agencies are at supporting parents to rehabilitate and improve. Parenting is obviously a learned skill. And we each generation try and not make the mistakes our parents made. And so hopefully we're doing well at it. But I also acknowledge that for a lot of parents who've never had a good model of parenting, it's very hard. And I think one of the things we should do as a community, unlegislated but supportive, especially church communities, but charities largely of any worldview, we should really focus on what we can do to support mothers and fathers to be functional, whole, and well-rounded contributors to society. So what are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think parenting is a really vital role that parents play, and they shape the future life of their children. And so I think the church has a very significant role to play in actually teaching Christian parenting. My wife and I, when we were in pastoral ministry, we used to run the Growing Kids God's Way course for many, many years. And I've been out of pastoral ministry now for what would it be, about 15 years. And in that time, we still come across people who I've even forgotten they were in our classes, and they'll come up to us and say, "Oh, that was the best course we've ever done. It's made such a difference to our family," and so on.
Great.
So I think the the teaching of parenting, because there's so many false ideologies that are shaping parenting, that we really need to have a biblical basis that's grounded in God's word, which gives parents the confidence to actually parent. Because I've yet to find a parent who doesn't want to be a good parent. All parents want to be good parents, but there's so many conflicting ideas coming their way that they just don't have the confidence to do often what they think they should be doing, because Joe Blogg says this, or they've read this in the paper, or there's some report on TV that says this damage your child for life and all this sort of thing. And I think a solid biblical view of the child and the family really makes a big difference. But
what kind of topics did you cover in that course? Subjects that you wouldn't get in church, obviously.
Yeah, look, I mean, for example, the thing we focused on the first few sessions we actually did was the importance of a stable marriage relationship. We said the greatest gift you can give your child is actually a stable, loving marriage. That's critically important for a child to feel secure. And if a child feels secure and loved and knows that mum and dad love each other, a lot of the emotional issues that children struggle with often fall away. So that was one of the key things. The other things were things like bringing your child to first-time obedience, that you don't have to repeat yourself, but actually teach your children when you say something, you expect it done. And if they, once they've learned first-time obedience, that then they get to a point where if they really think that there is good reason not to do what you've asked them to do, they can politely ask the question, Mum, are you aware of this, this or that? And so it's not talking back, but they can engage with you and speak in a respectful way. And those sorts of just simple little things just make such a difference.
That's so good. I'm actually really intrigued by that course. And I applaud it. I think it's such a wonderful initiative for a community to say, how do we support parenting? Did you ever have people that were, I guess, remedial parenting courses to say they were in an acute state of dysfunction and came to the church to essentially prevent getting to the point of government intervention?
No, look, we never had that kind of, or we weren't aware that we had any of that kind of couple in our classes, let's put it that way. But generally, certainly in Western Australia, the biggest reason that children are taken away from parents is drug addiction. If both mum and dad, or mum who's got cut, if she's a single mum, if she's spaced out on drugs and the kids don't get fed, don't get to school and all that kind of thing, that's the biggest cause of children entering into the foster care system. And the abuse situations are certainly part of that as well, but drugs is by far the biggest issue.
Is adoption still happening in Western Australia? Has the special guardianship facility reduced even further the rate of adoption, or is it still happening at around the same rate?
Look, my understanding is there's only a handful of adoptions every year, and that was already back in 2008 when I entered Parliament. There was just a handful of adoptions a year in Western Australia. So adoption is very, very, it's a very minute thing. The special guardianship was actually not so much introduced as a alternative to adoption. I guess to some extent that was part of the thinking, but it was that you don't want to take children away from the connection with their biological parents. And so this special guardianship arrangement just allowed for the stability for the child, but still allowed, no matter how dysfunctional the parents are, for them to maintain some relationship with their children. Because I think, no matter how dysfunctional parents are, there is an inherent bond between mother and child, especially. And I think, when I was in Parliament, we had the surrogacy legislation before us. And so I did a lot of research around that whole issue of how important is it for children to actually to know their biological origins? And there is a lot of work being done by people who were conceived by donor sperm, and the deep, deep longing they have for finding out who is actually my biological father. That's been a real issue in this websites of people who really struggle with their identity because of that. And so I've certainly come to the conclusion that as a community, as much as possible, children should be, or families should be supported so that children can stay with mum and dad as much as possible. When that's not possible, then obviously a different arrangement needs to be undertaken. And I think that the special guardianship arrangement is a good one, because it gives stability for the child, but at the same time makes provision for maintaining the biological connection with the parents. And I think that that's vitally important.
In your role as the West Australian Director of the Australian Christian Lobby, what other issues are you campaigning on and advocating most frequently for in recent months?
Well, we've had the voluntary assisted dying bill, the whole euthanasia issue. We had that last year. Unfortunately, we didn't succeed in preventing that going through. We did manage to lobby hard for certain amendments, some of which did get up, which was good. But
what kind of amendments, please?
Well, now I have to put my thinking cap on. What amendments were there? We just trying to think which ones I can remember the ones we didn't get across the line.
Just as interesting.
Get across, yeah. The one was that the doctor should not be allowed to initiate the conversation about euthanasia with a patient. Victoria's legislation has that, but we didn't get that across the line here. Yeah,
you've got worse legislation than Victoria. Wow.
Yes. There's a number of areas where it's significantly different, and
that's terrible.
Not as tight.
Well, here in Queensland, that's this government's agenda. Although they've put it on the back burner until after the upcoming election. A very good reason to vote for a candidate who does not support euthanasia. Pick your party, I don't care, but just vote for a candidate. Ask the question, are you in favour of killing people?
I mean, I think the issue with the euthanasia bill was that people did have officially a conscience vote given by all parties, but there was enormous pressure on the Labor MPs, because there was a government bill to support that legislation.
I recommend that voters, regular citizens who want to, keep up their day job, whether it's a full-time homemaker, tradesman, businessman, clergy, whatever, approach every single candidate in your electorate when it's election time and ask them how they will vote. It doesn't matter what their party position is, that will be part of their answer. It doesn't matter what their personal beliefs are, that will be part of their answer. The thing you can hold them to is how they will vote. And if they lie, which candidates will sometimes tell voters what they want to hear, then we remember that at the next election and weigh their answers accordingly. Democracy will never, ever get it exactly right. It's a constant evolving thing, and we need to give them the feedback at the electorate box that the sanctity of life is a deal breaker, just like slavery would be. If you're a pro-slavery candidate, I'm going to be looking for someone who isn't, because that's a critical justice issue. There's lots of important issues. So that's my advocacy.
And that's actually another issue that we're working on here in Western Australia, is the whole issue of human sex trafficking and trying to get prostitution law reform happening here, because sex trafficking is an issue in Australia, although the media don't make a big deal issue of it. Sadly, too many people think of voluntary prostitution and coerced prostitution, but my experience is that it's actually all pretty much coerced prostitution. When I was a pastor, I was actually involved in counselling women leaving the sex industry and doing group work with Linda's House of Hope, and with the women coming out of the sex industry. And I've yet to find anybody who at the age of 14, 15, 16 thought it would be a great thing when they grow up to be a prostitute. It just doesn't, people don't think that way. It's, they either feel they've got no choice because they're so desperate for money, and often drug addiction leads them into that space, or they get pressured by a lover boy or someone else to make money through prostitution to feed their gambling habit or their drug habit. And it's a very sad state of affairs, and we're very actively promoting the Nordic approach, which basically makes it an offence to purchase or attempt to purchase sexual services. And so
you're criminalising the consumer, not the trafficked person.
Yeah, and basically the attempt is to drive down demand, and if we can drive down the demand, then organised crime will have no benefit from trafficking people in. If they can't sell the women, what's the point of doing it? And
is that an idealistic theory, or what kind of impact is it having in Nordic countries?
Well, the interesting is Sweden, which pioneered that legislation back in 1999. It came into effect in 1999 there. They have probably the smallest prostitution level in all of Europe. Basically, it's reduced street prostitution massively. Well, put it this way, before the law came in, they had about 500 brothels operating in Sweden. They were progressively shut down. And organised crime now finds Sweden not a good country to operate in, because it's very hard to actually sell product, as they call it. And also prostitution is the means by which organised crime launders their illegal proceeds from arms deals, from drug deals and all that, because most people who go to a brothel pay cash. And so if you're into organised crime, if you own a brothel, even if it doesn't actually make a lot of money for you, it creates the means whereby you can launder your money, and now you have clean money. And it's a real problem where they've legalised prostitution, that organised crime is inevitably gets involved in it, or continues to be involved in it, and it really hasn't helped at all to legalise or decriminalise. And there's a number of countries that have gone down that path now, which is Canada, Israel's recently gone down that path, France has as well, and Norway, Iceland. There's quite a number of countries that have gone down that path, and in those countries it is having that same effect as it has in Sweden, which is very encouraging.
Radical progressive Canada has gone down the Nordic model of legislation around sex trafficking, prostitution. Really?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the Nordic approach actually came not from the churches, it actually came from the radical feminists in Sweden, because basically they were starting to say, it used to be said by feminists, it's a woman's right to sell her body. How dare you tell her what she can do or can't do? But the Scandinavian feminists started singing from a different song sheet. They said, no, it's not like that. It's actually men with money exploiting vulnerable women. And when you think about it, they're actually spot on with that assessment. And in the Swedish parliament, there's about 55% of the MPs are women. And so they managed to push that legislation through back in 1998 and came into effect in 1999. And it's been incredibly successful, very successful.
And so was it do you know the battle in Canada? Was it feminists again who led it? Because it doesn't seem like the kind of legislation the country of Justin Trudeau would embrace. Was it under Stephen Harper that it was passed?
I can't actually recall who was the Prime Minister at the time, but I think in Canada, their High Court ruled that their prostitution legislation was had to be changed, because the prostitution in and of itself was not illegal, but running a brothel was, and the claim was made that prostitution is safer in a brothel than it is away from a brothel, and therefore the court ruled that if we allow prostitution, then it must be allowed to take place in the safest possible place. So they had to changed the legislation, and the government opened it up for public input, and the huge majority of the submissions they received were advocating for the Nordic approach. I think it was something like they got 16,000, if I remember rightly, submissions, and so the government decided to explore that, and they went down that path, and my understanding is it's working quite well.
Oh, that's fantastic. And what are your prospects for success with the Nordic model legislated in the land of the setting sun?
Well,
West
we
Australia.
are hopeful. The interesting thing is, I've spoken to both members of Parliament on both sides of the Parliament, both Labor and Liberal, gaining support for it, because when you explain the Nordic approach to people, it actually makes sense. You don't have to be a Christian to think that this makes sense. I think anybody who thinks seriously about the nature of prostitution and the inherent violence of prostitution recognises that we should have laws that absolutely reduce the number of people that involve themselves in this, I hate to call it an industry, but involve themselves in the sex industry. And so I've got people on both sides who are supportive and just busy, if you like, lobbying and just informing them. There's nothing before Parliament at the moment, and that's why we're actually working on this, is because if the government puts up legislation, then that's, say, for legalising or decriminalising, then you've got the problem that you're actually fighting against what they're putting up. So by talking to MPs now, when there's nothing on the horizon for changing the legislation, we're just trying to build a grassroots support for a different way of looking at it. And if we can get that happening over the next 6 or 12 months, that would be really positive. And interestingly, the Liberal Party state conference about 18 months ago passed the motion urging the parliamentary party to actually seriously consider taking the Nordic approach as a policy position to the next state election in March next year. So that's quite an interesting development. Now, whether the party does that or not remains to be seen, because the Lay Party can't dictate to the parliamentary party. It's up to them.
Yep.
But again, I think the whole thing of prostitution and what we talked about earlier about adoption and the special guardianship thing and all of that, in a sense, they're all very interconnected. It's all about valuing life, sanctity of life. Would you want your daughter to be working as a prostitute? That's for those people who say we should legalise it, decriminalise it. I always say to them, how would you feel if your daughter came home and said, guess what, I'm going to make lots of money, I'm going to go and be a prostitute? What would you think? And everybody's horrified at that prospect.
If they're honest.
Yeah. And I think everybody, nobody wants their daughter to be in that industry.
No, it's not what you dream of for your child's future career. You can be anything you want, but that's not one of the things you would not. Look, there are some really messed up people out there. So there may be some people listening who say they would celebrate their daughter's independence to have autonomy over her own body, but I think that's more of a virtue signalling response than an authentic, sincere parental desire for the children. But look, certainly both abortion and prostitution, I think, are a failing of us, the community, to adequately provide support and options and acceptance for the difficult circumstances that women may often find themselves in. And I think it's very incumbent on us to preemptively say, hey, we're here to support you. What can we do? We celebrate who God made you, and that includes a person. Look, the Brookings Institute of America says if you want to avoid poverty, there are 3 things you need to do: finish school, get a job, and don't have kids before you're married. That's a leftist think tank, liberal think tank, and they've concluded that these fundamental Christian values very conservative values,
Yes.
personal responsibility, finish school, get a job, and don't have kids before you get married. Quite often it's these pressures of poverty and a sense of a lack of other choices which leads people into thinking abortion is a choice, the only choice that they've got, or that sex trafficking themselves, or coercion into either of those by somebody else is a choice that they should be making. And the challenge is to continually figure out and ask ourselves, what can we do to make a difference? And would somebody feel comfortable coming and talking to me about the situation they find themselves in? And so having conversations which then promote and foster that sense of unconditional acceptance without endorsing bad ideas, of course.
Yeah, because I think that's a really important point that you make, is that we don't want to condone people not looking after their children. We don't want to condone people entering into sexual relationship outside of marriage and so on. But when it does happen and a child is on the way, we need to recognise that child has inherent value, and that's why we oppose abortion, and we should try and support the mother or the couple as much as we can to actually take responsibility for their actions and move forward with that.
Exactly right. Peter, thank you very much for your time today. We've had a great chat on a couple of topics. I love where my curiosity can sometimes take me that we weren't planning on going, but that's all the richer and experience for having somebody really interesting and knowledgeable to talk to. So thank you for being my guest on Pellowe Talk today.
My pleasure.
It's time for us to do something.